this time. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Erik Evrard, and I work for Platform SH. And I will not talk about my company or what we do. Instead, we'll talk about something else. Did you know that in 1916, Charlie Chaplin closed a contract in which he made $670,000 to make 12 movies with full creative liberty and control, which is much more than the GDP average, of course, in that time. And that would be $11 million nowadays. And of course, he's not alone. We know that in Hollywood, many actors make a tremendous amount of money, typically thousands of times more than the average citizen. And it is not even restricted to the USA. That is also true in countries like India, where Shah Rukh Khan makes even much more money, relatively speaking, to the GDP of his country. Now, is that a coincidence? Because these people sometimes don't show big entrepreneurship. When they invest their money in other businesses, they sometimes lose it. So there is something strange going on. And I will demonstrate you later that there is actually a scientific and mathematical reason why in the entertainment business you can make so much money. Another example, if you go to the Piazza San Marco in Venice, it's beautiful. And if you sit down, and I witnessed this myself, I saw some tourists from the Netherlands enjoying coffee and watching carefully if the menu didn't entail any surprises. And no, it was €6. It's expensive, it's worth it. And afterwards, when the bill came, they noticed they had to pay as much for the coffee as for live music that they were watching, and that was also on the menu. A typical tourist trap. And there are many like this. And if you take any kind of US city and you watch how fast food restaurants and service stations are distributed, they seem to be all cluttered around some locations. Even in my own city in Belgium, there are not so many petrol stations, but they all tend to be together. Why is that? And one last thing, all these things seem totally unrelated, and yet they are related to something. They are linked. Rudy Giuliani sent this tweet a few weeks ago. What is that? All these things that seemingly unrelated actually can be explained by game theory. And I'm not pretending to give you a full course in game theory. This is something you can do your own. There are master classes and all that. But I want you to recognize strategic situations, and also want you to make better decisions and even change the game. Because the people who are able to change the game, they can actually turn them into their own advantage. So what are business goals? Well, business goals is actually easy. You want to make money, right? We all want to acquire wealth. And in a very simplistic situation, you have strategies, and basically you take money from somebody else. In the most simplistic approach, you take that money, and this is a zero-sum world, as we call it. That money just goes elsewhere. The thing is, this isn't realistic, because we know that in reality, we create value. We actually add more value, and the world is not a zero-sum world. So, by showing that matrix, you already saw some key ingredients in every game. And what is a game? A game is actually any strategic situation where people make rational decisions. And every game has three components: players, strategies, and a payoff matrix, or sometimes multiple. In reality, these payoff matrices can be very complex. I will show you several, and they will all look very simplistic. But in reality, if you do this for real, face complexity. But there are lots of computer programs that deal with this. Now, so this is a takeaway, and I'll give you a couple of takeaways in this session. Let's start with the business dilemma. Why is there a dilemma? Well, a buyer wants the best value for his money, and a seller wants to get make most money. And this again is represented in a payoff matrix, like for instance this one. Values are a bit arbitrary, but you can see that the seller and the buyer, when they compromise, they all get a decent value for their price, and the seller gets a decent amount of money for the product he's selling. However, if one of the two parties is raising his demands, things change and the other party goes out empty-handed with a less optimal situation. And if both parties raise their demands, there's no business transaction and you end up with 0-0, no payoff. Now, if you look at this matrix and suppose the buyer compromises, what should the seller do? Well, the seller, he should follow a strategy that increases his own payoff, which means he also has to raise demands. But if the buyer raises demands, the seller has to do the same, because in that matrix, his own payoff will also increase. That means there is a dominant strategy. A dominant strategy is a strategy that brings you the best payoff, irrespectively of what the other party is doing. And since this matrix is symmetrical, it also applies to the buyer. He should also raise his demands. Now that means if both do that, you end up with nothing. And this is what we call a Nash equilibrium. If you follow the dominant strategies, you end up with some equilibrium, but it's not really an interesting situation. In reality, this won't happen, and people will actually find a way to compromise to a certain extent. But in any case, Nash equilibriums are really important in game theory. Now, I just mentioned dominant strategy. There's also the opposite, a dominated strategy. And that is a strategy where you always lose. There's always something better than that choice. And obviously, you should avoid to pursue a dominated strategy. Let me give you an example. This man is just hailing a cab. He's in front of it. He's in full control. The lady comes to him and starts shouting. She wants the cab, and she insults him. She steals his cab. But she is actually not very smart, because whatever she does, it's not helping her situation. It is a dominated strategy. She could tell him she's ill and needs to see a doctor, or she's got an important meeting, or some other things. And all these things would increase her chances, at least by a bit, that he would give away the cab. But by shouting, you chose the dominated strategy, and that's the worst one to pick. So another takeaway is never ever play a dominated strategy. Now, I mentioned all these businesses and why they're cluttered around some locations. Imagine there's one business, a monopoly, and on a line, and the consumers are spread all over the line equally. Obviously, no matter where the business is, they will capture 100% of the market. If a second company enters the market, they will capture proportionally the same amount of customers, depending on the locations. And we assume here the prices are the same, the products are the same, and there's no distinction between the two. Of course, number two could choose this location, and he will capture a bigger part of the market. What does this mean? This means it would have been a much better choice for the first company to go in the middle. You can actually demonstrate this mathematically, and that is why so many businesses tend to clutter around some locations which are more or less somewhere in the middle of their market. That also is applying to positioning. Where do you position yourselves? If you are new, you want to capture a part of the market, put yourself in the middle and you have the best chances to fence yourself against entrants. They have a harder time to capture a part of your market. And you can, of course, this is called the deviator share. This is a problem you can easily solve mathematically. Now, if you are in business, there's something called adverse selection. And that is actually based on a very important thing, and that is incomplete information. Very often, buyers don't have full insight in your products, and that is true for every type of business. Buyers are willing to pay you a lot of money for a high-quality product, and they will pay a little bit of money for a low-quality product, but they are afraid of a situation where they pay a lot of money for a low-quality product. And that is then adverse selection. And you can demonstrate, and this is not something I will do here, that in game theory, this will render the prices down. There's a downward spiral to low quality products and low quality prices. Obviously, in reality, there are high quality prices and high quality products. That is because companies can protect themselves from this adverse selection. You can inform your customers, you can give references, you can protect yourselves or themselves legally by giving guarantees and SLAs and a money-back guarantee. There are many things you can do so you can reverse this situation, but you have to do this, otherwise you get to a downward spiral and your high-quality product will not be valued enough. A related thing is moral hazard. That is a situation where you start with a high-quality product, and once the deal was closed, you start lowering the threshold. And this is in your payoff matrix, a situation like this. The buyer has already compromised, but once the deal's been closed, you raise your demands as a seller, and the buyer goes out with a less favorable situation. This is what we call a bait and switch situation, and that is the link with tourist traps, because that's what they do too. There's a bait, and then they switch the situation. But this happens in Drupal, this happens in the software industry. You sign a deal, you can go on for a while, and then suddenly your quality of service decreases. Obviously, if you want to stay in business for a long time, you have to prevent this, because a recurring business on the long run is better. Tourist traps happen mostly in countries that are not the wealthiest. And although it looks like you create some extra quick money, it is a one-off, obviously. Customers will not return, and you fall into this trap only once. Now, we get to another thing, the prisoner's dilemma. I think this is one of the most famously known things in game theory. What's the situation? The situation is you have two prisoners, so two gangsters. They've been apprehended by the police and are interviewed by them. The police doesn't have much evidence against them, and if none of them would confess, they would each get 1 year of prison for just weapons possession or something. But if they would confess, they would get 10 years. But the deal that the police makes with them is if they both confess, they get half that term of each 5 years. Now, if you look at this strategy, what should they do? Well, if they disclose, the other party should obviously conceal, and vice versa. So the dominant strategy is that they always disclose, but then they end up with a situation where they serve a 5-year term, which is not the best. If they would cooperate, they would get just 1 year. The thing is, they cannot communicate, and in reality, people don't trust each other very often. But now we get to the real situation. So this would be the best payoff. But of course, in reality, other things are at stake. Maybe one of the others threatened the family member some harm or whatever. So in this case, you get a different payoff matrix where it's not your term, but your total well-being of your family is at stake. And in that case, you get different situations where you have no normal equilibria, where you have maybe rotating scenarios and all that. It depends what the figures are, but you can actually have different matrices. Now, another thing is these irrational, well, I spoke about ratio. In game theory, we assume that people are rational and take the most rational decisions. Of course, in reality, that is not always the case, and there are limits to the number of things we consider in a rational way. Now, it is actually possible to model this, and you can put some subjective beliefs into your payoff matrices as well. And I think even with something like IT and Drupal, it's worthwhile to consider that and see if your customers are sensitive to non-objective argumentation. But can you actually win the prisoner's dilemma? Because it looks like it's always deficient, it's never optimal. Well, yes, and let me give you an example. From 2009 to 2012, there was this MTV reality show called Jersey Shore, where they followed 8 people in their holiday resort in New Jersey. And that lady, her nickname was Snooki, was famous. She had 2 sponsors, Gucci and Coach, big brands. Well, Snooki made them play the prisoner's game so that they lost. What did she do? There she is, always showing off with these Gucci and Coach bags. Well, she was very often drunk, and she sometimes threw up in the bags. Of course, Gucci and Coach didn't like that very much, so they did something which they call unbranding. But Gucci stopped sending her Gucci bags. But what did Coach do? Coach sent her Gucci bags. So Snooki kept showing off Gucci bags, and when Gucci saw that, they started sending her Coach bags. So what was the result? They both paid more money because they had to pay money from for the other bags, and they were in the same situation as before. And that is the prisoner's dilemma. So Snooki was actually in a situation where she made the others play and actually convinced them of sending this. She was in the plot. And only after 1 year, both brands stopped sending her because they were actually paying to destroy their own image. Now, another example, Southwest. If you've ever been flying Southwest, you may know this, but you've been playing the prisoner's role, the prisoner's dilemma. For a long time, they had these boarding groups, and it was a lottery. So you were either A, B, C, and you could board first, and if you were first, you just take a seat. There's no seat reservation. So people in group A had the first choice. But what they did, and this is what happened, something happened in their revenue. It was jumping up. Well, they introduced an early bird scheme, and if you paid for that, you were in group A, and you had the first choice. It was tremendously popular. So popular that people started paying for an early bird and was still in group B and C and didn't get a very good seat. But there was no alternative, because if you wouldn't pay it, you would definitely end up in group D and have the worst seat of all. So people kept paying, and that's why they made so much more money for having the same situation as before. Same situation here as Gucci and Coach. The airline made you, the passengers, play the prisoner's game, and you were in this very bad situation. Now, this applies to many situations. I'm not going to details, but healthcare systems are an example. US systems versus other systems actually are all prisoners' dilemmas in which regulation can make all the difference in introducing this key element of comfort, trust, that puts you in a much better situation. Otherwise, you pay a premium for having the same thing. So my other takeaway is, don't try to play it yourself. Let others play it for you. You'll be in another situation. And when you think of it, there are situations where you can do this. If you have help desks, I mean, it's maybe unethical, but you can introduce schemes where you make your customers pay more money for getting the same service. I'm not recommending it. I think it's a bit unethical, but at least others are doing it. But you can also change the rules in another way. Who knows this? Miles probably does. Golden ball, split or steal. Very famous game on the BBC. And what's the deal? Well, the deal is you get an amount of money, 2 players, and they have a ball with split or steal. They show it together, and if it says split, split, they split the money. If it's split, split, steal, the one who says steal gets all the money, and vice versa. When they both have steal, nobody gets money. It's also a prisoner's dilemma, and this is the payoff matrix. So a few years ago, I think Steve and Sarah, and look, they made a deal. We both do a split. It was £100,000. And they looked each other in the eyes and said, we'll split, all right, split. Each 50, I'm happy with 50. And look, Sarah had steal, got away with all the money. And poor Steve, Sarah, is a bit mean. But it's normal. Sarah's playing the dominant strategy. This is the dominant strategy. But how can you turn the game? Later, another guy came, and his name was, well, okay, this actually explains why it was a bad idea to split. Because if you decide on splitting, if one person says, I will split for sure, the other person obviously must pick. The dominant strategy means he has to do steal. He gets a free ticket to all the money. So what did the other person do? Nick. Well, Nick changed the rules, and he said, look, I will steal. I guarantee you I will steal the money. Everybody was surprised, but he added something, and he said, afterwards, if you've shown split, I will still split the money with you outside the game. And everybody's flabbergasted. Why don't we both split? That was not a dominant strategy. And look what happened. So this is the payoff matrix. And what did he do? He showed split as well. The other person was taken by surprise, and his payoff matrix, his dominant strategy, was obviously to show split, because otherwise he would lose. I mean, he had no alternative. So by doing this, by changing the rules, bending them, Nick could actually manipulate the prisoner's dilemma into his own advantage. So it is possible in some situations to negotiate this. So my takeaway is obviously try to do that. If there are procedures, see if you find a way around it. And in between, talking about negotiations, what if you've got lots of people and one person pours drinks and you're afraid he will pour too much for himself? Well, one of the rules you can change is make sure that he's the last person to pick his glass. And then he will have a huge incentive to make sure that every glass is filled equally, because he's the last one to pick. And that's also game theory. You can put this in a matrix and see that his incentive is simply, his dominant strategy is to be fair. So you can impose fairness by having the right rules. So that's my other takeaway. Make sure that in a negotiation with money, distribution, whatever, make sure that he has to assign his own amount of money. Make sure he's the last one to pick. Battle of the Sexes, it's another game. I'm not going too much into this one. And actually, I've turned it around a bit. It was very sexist. So we got a couple, traditional couple, and the male likes opera, and the female likes football. And what's the rule? The rule is they don't communicate. They just go to any of those two venues, and they see what happens. If they're both at the opera, then the husband is happy, the female not, but happy because they're together. If they end up being alone, it's okay. If they're in the wrong location alone, it's bad. So this is the matrix. This doesn't have any good strategy behind it. And there's a whole theory how you have to deal with such situations, randomizing and optimizing and all that. I'm showing you this to show that it's not always as easy as the prisoner's dilemma. And obviously you have situations with lots of partners and lots of values and all that. So these are the equilibria, but they're not very good. Another game, very famous game, Game of Chicken. Game of Chicken is when two cars are in a head-on collision, and if you swerve, you lose. If you stay straight, you win, unless both of them stay straight, and then they die. You win and die. So this is the payoff matrix. This is a very common game, actually. And there are two equilibria. And basically, this is an anti-cooperation or collaboration game, because you have to do the opposite of the other person, whatever he's doing. Now, can you win a game of chicken? Because this happens a lot. Yes. I mean, what's a game of chicken in a negotiation? You're selling Drupal, and the guy has Adobe in-house, and you want to replace it. And no, I can't. Well, he's using actually one, he says, my boss is deciding, and he's in Australia. So what he does is actually he makes himself immovable. That's one of the strategies to win a game of chicken. Well, my steering wheel is blocked. If your steering wheel is blocked, and you know this, and the other guy knows it, then he will swerve, because you don't have control. So try to make a situation happen where you're immovable, and you will have an advantage. Another one is to increase stakes. Maybe you're not driving a car, but bumper cars. Well, it's not bad. But then say you're switching from a bumper car to a real car. The risk is getting bigger. That is what we call brinkmanship. And this is the street. I mean, impeaching Trump entails a certain risk, but Giuliani said, it would be a revolt. It would be, and Trump added, we will all get very poor. So he's raising the stakes. And actually, this is a very nice example of brinkmanship in game theory. He sees this as a game of chicken where he's raising the stakes. And this is exactly what's happening here. Now, also in negotiations, it's important to know what focal points are. Focal points are things we assume or we have a tendency to prefer. I mean, before we had mobile phones and we had to meet, we tended to go to local places and venues at times were fixed. If I would say I would tell you, let's meet in London next week, somewhere on Monday. But I don't tell you where and when. Well, most people would pick noon. That's the preferred. And the second preferred, next one would be 9 o'clock in the morning. And people would take landmarks. So focal points happen. I mean, we know that banks close at 5:30 or 5 p.m. and not at 5:16 or some other strange numbers. So these focal points are very important, but also in negotiations and in game theory. By assuming some knowledge on focal points, thresholds where people decide when do people start sweating about something, these focal points are important to consider, and you have to put this into your payoff matrix. And these focal points help you to coordinate without communication, obviously, because you're in a negotiation phase and you're not cheating, right? Another game is the ultimatum game. Now that's an important one, and it starts with a silly game. Take person one. Person one has $100 or 100 euros, and he says, let's split 50-50. And the second person says, yes or no. If he says yes, you split the money, as you agreed. But if he says no, nobody gets the money. What happens? Well, obviously, this game stinks for person two. On the other hand, if person one says 1 cent, I would still say yes, because 1 cent is better than nothing. However, that's the rational decision. People don't act that way. People will consider something which is called fairness, and they think, that's not fair. You should give me more. And they've been doing tests, it lies around 20%, but it depends very much on the person. I know people who say, I want 90%. This is actually what happens in strikes, situations with unions. When they strike, there's an ultimatum, and if there's no agreement, both end up with nothing. The workers don't get money, and the company doesn't get productivity. So these things happen in real life as well. And the fairness is an element. And in your payout matrix, sometimes you have to put different elements than just that. So the background here is the green-eyed monster of jealousy. And that is one of these irrational things that live in us. And it actually turns out, if you make matrices and you put in relatively payouts instead of absolute values, something really strange happens. In every game, a game that was profitable for both parties and that had payoffs and that was a non-competing game and non-zero-sum game turns into a zero-sum game with competition. So actually, it's worse off. So if you introduce jealousy in your matrix, in your real-life situations, you end up with a less favorable situation. You can show this mathematically in game theory. Now, related to the ultimatum game, this is actually happening in politics. The Cold War. America, Soviet Union, had weapons of mass destruction. They could do two things, back off and strike. Now, the green circle here means this is not a sequential game. The decisions are made simultaneously, almost instantly. And of course, there are various solutions or outcomes of this. And the best one is when they both back off and there's peace with tension, hence the -1. And every other situation hence results in a total destruction of the world. There are two equilibria, but one is total destruction of the world, and most sensible people won't like that. So obviously they chose back off, fortunately. A similar situation are gossip wars, where the press is fighting with a celebrity about whatever. It can be multiple levels in history when they release something and then they still back off. Both benefit from the situation because the press lives from the celebrities, and if they put somebody over the edge that he's no longer in the game, they will lose out as well because they lose a celebrity person. Now, you may think, what has this got to do with us? Well, it turns out that in business negotiations, you very often also in these situations where you end up with a stalemate situation and you have to try to prevent it. It's always better to avoid the total destruction scenario, which has happened in some situations. Now, all these things work. Why did the Cold War finally, I would say, succeed? It's because the threat was credible. The threat of total destruction is real. So if you in an ultimatum game or you play chicken and you actually utter a threat, make sure it's credible. But if it's not credible, you can make it seem credible. And that actually helps. So you don't need nuclear arms in your company, but you can have some situation like burning bridges. I never want to do business with you again. I'll write a bad review. Things like this, burning bridges. And it's even better to burn a bridge that doesn't exist in the first place. Sometimes there is no relationship yet, and you still threaten to burn it. Now, we're still in this negotiation phase, and I think one of the most powerful things is scarcity. Take this game. Somebody buys you matches of cards, so black and red, and he pays you 100 euros for this. So you got a full deck, 26 cards, and the person below has the black cards. And then there's 26 students, each with a red card. Now, obviously, they will start negotiating. And what happens is that every student says, I've got potentially 100 euros. And the person below says, I've got potentially 2,600 euros if I get the card. So he has to talk with all these students and negotiate. Now, they will negotiate, and they will probably end up somewhere in the middle. And the person gives the student 50 euros, gets the card, and he will get 100 for the pair, and makes his money. So he makes a profit, and the student also makes a profit. It seems fair. This is a balanced situation. Now the black person has a cunning plan. What does he do? He burns one card, and he burns it in front of the eyes of all the students. He knows that one black card is gone. That changes the game entirely. Entirely. Why? Because suddenly one of the students' cards is obsolete. And now he can outplay them together. He can negotiate with each of them. And if you are clever like this, you can actually drive the price down to 1 cent and that one student, and they will do it because they know they might be the one which is obsolete. And you can suddenly change the game, and person to the right with all the cards ends up with most of the profit, and the others go out with peanuts. And this happened many times in business. Microsoft only having so many icons for browsers on their interface, and Nintendo doing things, creating scarcity is a very powerful thing. That's why regulators will try to interfere in these situations, but it's not easy. But you can try to do this also at every company's level, and I think it's a bit less unethical than trying to do the other thing. So I would say scarcity is something you control, and be aware of the value creation of scarcity in some situations. Be aware of that. Look at this example. This is a real thing. You can try it out with people. Now, that is the limiting options scenario. Now, I mentioned to you Charlie Chaplin and all these other rich people. By the way, Charlie Chaplin managed to get rich even in the Big Depression. That's really amazing. Why is it so different? Well, the whole thing is this little red circle. This is the same matrix as before with business. However, there is something strange here. In the situation where the seller, which is the entertainer in this case, is really good, he is clever enough to convince the audience, the enjoyers, that they should surrender and not want their own taste, but just release themselves, open up to his artistic creativity and his dream world. Then suddenly this matrix turns from a -5 into a +5. That is the difference with the previous one. This is really what happens in entertainment business. And if you work out what the dominant strategy is, the dominant strategy is that the entertainers should never compromise and that the enjoyers always should. So in the entertainment industry, you should relax, enjoy, and watch the show, and don't say, I want to see this, I want to see this, and I want to see this. Otherwise, you get a 5-5. There are mediocre entertainers and a mediocre audience. However, if entertainer is good and drives you into this little corner there, then they both end up happy. The enjoyers are really happy by compromising, and the entertainer does not have to compromise and actually makes more money. Now, that is a world based on fantasy, not tangible things. However, it is important to realize that this has a value in real life as well. You should always try to mix a little bit of magic, a little bit of surprise, and a little bit of entertainment into your products, how boring they are. And that is why companies like Apple charge so much more for their products, although their base value is lower than what they sell them for. That is because they were really, really good in constantly creating this show and this entertainment business. And that is because the little circle in that corner. But I think everybody can do that. Even if you have a very boring product, you can do it. And I think Drupal is definitely not boring. So that is a key. Now, finally, we come to competition. And I think this is really important because we all try to compete into the enterprise market with Drupal. We see companies like Sitecore and Adobe who are really, really big and expensive, and I think we've got a good market for us. So if you've got a situation with a monopoly price and another company starting with a competitive price, obviously it is interesting to offer a competitive price. If the product is the same, the competitor will make more money. And the equilibrium will be that both start competing. That's why prices tend to converge more to the lower end if the products are the same. But then there can be price wars. Price wars is when one company is aggressive and really goes goes to the marginal cost. If you do this, you end up with such a situation where both converge to the competitive price level. Now, a danger in all these situations is when there is tacit collusion. Tacit collusion is when they sort of all silently agree on the same price level. That's also something that for the consumer and for the buyer is not so favorable. That's like the prisoners or the gangsters agreeing on the better scenario for them, not for society necessarily. I think this is something where regulation plays a role. That's why we always look at pricing agreements, even if they're tacit. Now, of course, in many games, you've got long-run games because there can be cycles in sales and in price evolution, and you can have multiple rounds. And this is a bit like in the situation with the tourist trap or the moral hazard. You can actually compromise and have a small payoff, and then at the end start cheating. But you don't. But because you've got always the opportunity of cheating at the end, you will continue in further rounds. So I think long-term, it's always useful to invest in long-term games. But what about entry deterrence? This is an important one, because we mentioned Adobe and we mentioned Sitecore and all that. If you've got a game with an incumbent who's more or less established in a certain market, and you're the entrant, well, there can be two things happening. Either the entrant says, oh, no, I won't try. He will end up with nothing. VM means monopoly value 0. But the incumbent, they can say, well, yes, let's go ahead. And then there's two options, share or fight. And depending on the situation, you end up with some share of the market. Of course, an incumbent can fight harder and fight with a lot of money and invest it. And if you put this into a matrix, it's quite interesting. You can learn something from it. And the takeaway is you should see how far can they go in fighting. Will they undercut your prices or not? This is something I won't go into. There are various scenarios how somebody can react. in the way the fierceness, if it's active or passive, if it's fighting or not fighting. That is more a strategy of a company, but it all has results in game theory. Overall, the conclusion is it's always worthwhile to compete unless somebody will fight to death and invest all his money in it to fight you off. If that's not the case, you can always enter a new market with your product. That is basically what almost all models in game theory say. So never be afraid of entering Adobe market and the big corporate markets with our products. You can demonstrate that this works. Something about craziness. Well, we said that everything's based on rational things, and sometimes people do very crazy things. I mean, inexplicable behavior. It's been argued that that's been the case with Nixon. I'm not mentioning any modern presidents, but being crazy can set you off once, and then they never take you seriously unless you're inescapable, like a dictator or something. But being crazy can be a strategy for a while. I think my time's up. I've got some more slides after this, but they will come with a very nice write-up. So if you're interested in learning more about this, the hawk-dove game, that's very interesting. Should you fight, should you not? I've written a nice story around that, and you can always contact me, and I will happily share this with you. And I think it makes sense for Drupal, because we're at the brink of entering in a new phase of corporate markets. And believe me, these companies like Adobe and Sitecore, they have game theorists inside their company. They do have them. And they actually use strategies which are more formal than what we've been traditionally doing as a startup. So that's it. I have to skip these slides because my time is up, unfortunately. So there you go.
Well, we have only 2 minutes, so maybe is there a question?